By midnight on the 10th of November 1918, Big Ben had been silent for 4 years and 3 months, while Britain was at war with Germany. 11 hours later, on Monday the 11th, the clock would strike again to announce the end of the greatest slaughter the world had ever known. On that day, the survivors and their families would be caught in cross currents of happiness, grief, and confusion. They would look back at a world that had gone forever and ask themselves what had happened to it and why. Every town, every village, almost every family had lost someone. They would wonder what kind of world was waiting for them now. All this was 80 years ago, but from letters and diaries and the stories they told their children and grandchildren, we can share what they felt on the day the guns fell silent and the killing ended. We can see how the Great War changed everything. We can see how the world we live in now was born then. In the early hours of November the 11th, in a railway carriage in a siding in the forest of Compiègne, near Paris, the future of the world was about to be decided. After 3 days of negotiations, the German representatives were facing defeat and humiliation at the hands of the French Supreme Commander, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and the British First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Roslin Weems.
It is a curious scene in the middle of the forest, raining and leaves falling, and yet there is nothing sad, at any rate for us. The two trains, 200 yards off each other, stray sentries in blue-grey can be seen amongst the trees. Nothing else in sight. We are in telephonic communication with Paris and the world. It was obviously a time of enormous excitement and not quite sure if they believed that the war was really going to end, because it had been such a horrible war, and 1918 had been as horrible as any year. Terrific casualties among the Allies all through 1918. And so they were keyed up, hoping that the Germans were really going to give in. And luckily for them, the Germans really were crumbling. There were mutinies going on in the fleet, and there was a mutiny in the army, and the whole German home front seemed to be cracking up. And that was the background against which these German plenipotentiaries had to enter this very difficult negotiation for them.
The final meeting began at 2:15 a.m. The long list of stiff Allied terms was read out: wholesale surrender of artillery, machine guns, lorries, locomotives, aircraft and ships, and of course withdrawal from all occupied territory. One by one, most reluctantly, the conditions were accepted. One of the Germans, General Winterfeld, wept. Finally, at 5:10 a.m., the armistice was signed. No one shook hands.
The Germans then went back to their train, and we dispersed. Having to start for Paris at 7:30 a.m., I felt it was too late to go to bed, and so I went for a walk in the forest, and it was a queer feeling that I had that the war was at last over, and that bloodshed would cease at 11 o'clock.
During the next 6 hours, between signing and ceasefire, there was to be no let-up in the fighting, which would continue to the very last minute. Different units heard about the armistice at different times, by field telephone, Morse code, dispatch rider or runner. The signal was also transmitted throughout the day from the Eiffel Tower. Captain Arnold Thompson, Scots Guards and 19th Infantry Brigade, heard the news just after 8 o'clock.
I know what my father was doing at 08:11 on the 11th of November. He was reading this signal here: hostilities will cease at 1100 hours today, November the 11th. Stop. There will be no intercourse of any description with the enemy. Stop. Addressed to all concerned from the 33rd Division, and it was sent at 7:57 on the 11th of November. He felt, because he told me, enormous relief that it was over. He fought as a private soldier and as a junior officer and as a staff officer, so he saw the war from the beginning to the very end. He never made out that it was a glorious and wonderful thing to do, and he described being shelled in the middle of the night. He wished almost anything would happen to remove him from this place, because he felt so terrified and so depressed by this shelling. There were many unpleasant ways to die, and the one that I think most people feared most was being buried alive when a large shell hit your trench or your dugout, and you were then covered in soil many feet deep, suffocating to death. And that is something that my father told me that he feared. He told me what life in trenches was like. A trench would be quite deep, say the depth of this room, and 2 or 3 feet wide, and people lived in what they called dugouts, which were little caves dug into the front edge of the trench, not the back end, because that was where the shrapnel would go. And of course later on they built more sophisticated dugouts where you went down steps into quite large accommodation, but of course it was all below ground. The fetid smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, fear, cooking, and then of course the smell of the lavatories which had been dug into the back end of the trenches. The trenches flooded when it rained, and so they would be anything up to waist deep at times. So you waded along through this filth, which smelt of sewers, of excrement, dead bodies rotting in the parapet, dead bodies out in front of you that smelt, turning black in the sun, some of them your friends, who you had to watch this happening to.
This film shows men of the Lancashire Fusiliers sheltering in a sunken road in no man's land, minutes before going into action.
Anyone who's never been into battle before doesn't know what to expect, and therefore they are apprehensive in the sense that they don't know what's going to happen, exactly the same as anybody's apprehensive about anything that they are not sure of. And the one overriding thing in their minds is that they're going to let the side down because they're not going to perform properly. That tends to be the overriding feeling, which is why they do perform well, because they've got that spur. The second, third and fourth times round, you know what it's going to be like. You don't like what you're about to going to have to do. If you're very busy because you're a commander, that takes your mind off it. But if you're a private soldier and haven't really got much to think about except what's coming, then there is this apprehension which is best described by knowing what it's like to stick your finger in the electric plug and then having to do it again and again and again, because that's what you've got to do.
With no radio or television to tell them what was happening at the front, people at home relied on letters, newspapers and magazines. Every week for 4 years, the London Illustrated News carried eyewitness reports, photographs and artists' impressions of battles. One of the people who followed the war at a distance was a Mr. Frederick Robinson of Cobham in Surrey. Every day from 1914 to 1918, he studied the newspapers and entered his notes and comments, including the casualty figures, in a war diary which grew to 3,000 pages. November the 11th, 1918, a day never to be forgotten. The day has come at last which we have waited for these long 4 years and 3 months. The horrible thing is over. The last of our enemies is beaten, and her once mighty emperor is a fugitive, and his empire is crumbling to the dust. It is difficult to believe all this, yet it is true. 2 years earlier, Robinson had travelled up to London from Cobham to watch a government-made film called The Battle of the Somme. The film was shot by 2 official cameramen during the build-up and the first day of the battle in July 1916. It was shown in cinemas all over Britain while the battle continued through the summer months. It was a sensation. "Londoners cannot go to the front to see the war," wrote Robinson, "but the war has been brought to London for Londoners to see. The official war films which are now being exhibited bring home the realities of the war perhaps more than anything else could. You actually see one of the regiments dash over the parapet of their trench, alas, leaving some of their number shot dead before your eyes." It is now believed that these scenes of soldiers shot as they left the trenches were faked at a training ground earlier. Done for television now, it would be labelled reconstruction. The intention was to convey what had become the key experience of war on the Western Front: infantrymen going over the top. It is a sanitized version of events. There was genuine documentary footage of the wounded and the dead, and people had never seen anything like it. Frederick Robinson was enthusiastic about this new kind of war reporting. "All this is for good," he wrote. "As the King is reported to have said, the public should see these pictures that they may have some idea of what the army is doing and what war means." Which is quite true, provided their nerves are strong enough. What people properly take exception to is that these films, with all their realism and awfulness, should be shown sandwiched between farces of the Charlie Chaplin type. When I saw the films, they were immediately followed by a farce called Fickle Fatty's Fall, which could certainly not have been in worse taste. The Battle of the Somme lasted 4 months. It moved the front line a few miles nearer Germany at a cost of 400,000 British casualties. The German casualties were 600,000. This was the nature of the war. In the Great War, people would learn some hard truths about their relationship with authority. They would discover that their leaders did not always have their best interests at heart and could be profligate with their soldiers' lives. In the trenches and on the battlefields, young men would learn a new cynicism, and those who survived would bring it home with them when the war was over.
The news of the signing of the Armistice was received in Accrington about 11:15. It flashed through the town almost with the rapidity of a wireless message, and in a few minutes the main street of the borough, which up to then had been quiet and lifeless, were the scene of great bustle and activity. Today the angel of peace has spread her healing wings over the torn and bleeding lands. Well may we rejoice, not riotously and with abandon, but gladly, with sober restraint and with heartfelt thanksgiving.
By November the 11th, 1918, almost every family in Accrington had lost a son, a father, a brother. The heart had been torn out of the community 2 years earlier. Like many towns in the north of England, Accrington was encouraged by its dignitaries to form a pals battalion. Pals because the men came from the same area, often worked together, and would therefore fight well together. This seemed a good idea, until the town's battalion was cut to pieces by shrapnel and machine gun. In July 1916, the Accrington Observer and Times found itself trying to make the best of some appalling facts. 1,000 men had answered the mayor's call for volunteers, and when the battalion went into action for the first time, it lost half its strength in a few minutes.
Here's the Accrington Observer from Saturday, July 8th, 1916. That's exactly 1 week after the fateful day when 585 members of the Accrington Pals Battalion were killed or wounded as they went over the top at the beginning of the Somme offensive. The Observer and Times records the incident with the headline, "Heroic Pals Who Fought and Fell." Here's an eyewitness account that the Accrington Observer had obtained from a war correspondent who had actually observed the events of July the 1st, 1916. He describes the Pals' great charge and their heroic advance against machine gun fire, and almost with a comic note he describes the lads went over smoking and joking, and he says later in his article, "Never shall I forget the scene I witnessed from that copse, and I feel real pride in the men of the North who strode forward in the face of those spitting machine guns and lines of German rifles as calmly as though going to their dinner, without any rushing or charging, just heading for the objective and caring for nothing except getting there." The thinking now is that maybe the Accrington Pals have often been described as lions led by donkeys. I think these men were victims. They were very courageous men, but they were perhaps naive, and I think they were perhaps sacrificed by the generals at the time. I think over the years the glory aspect wanes and people sat and thought about it and the way that it's been led. I think a little bit of resentment at the leadership and the qualities of the generals that had ordered those brave young men over the top was the feeling that stuck in a lot of people's throats.
The British Commander-in-Chief for most of the war was Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. On the 11th of November 1918, he was at his advance headquarters in Cambrai in northern France.
The first thought would have come into his mind was, well, thank God that's over. And he would have thanked not so much Lloyd George, but he would have thanked the Almighty and thanked his men. Monday, 11th November 1918. Fine day, but cold and dull. We were all taken on the cinema. General Plumer, whom I told to go off and be cinema'd, went off most obediently and stood before the camera trying to look his best, while Byng and others near him were chaffing the old man and trying to make him laugh.
Haig had finally defeated the German army, and after the war he would be given an earldom in recognition of his services to king and country. At the same time, he would be vilified by some as Butcher Haig, as a man who unflinchingly sent tens of thousands of men to their deaths on the Somme and at Passchendaele. Haig's diary entry for the 11th of November 1918 makes no mention of either slaughter or victory.
I don't think it was that sort of diary. And I think probably his real thoughts would, I think, be within himself and within his, if you like, his thankfulness to the Almighty for having achieved this victory. I think his, you know, that terrible, those losses. I mean, it must have, but he had to do his job, and his job was to win the battles, and the shame, the sadness, the tragedy of it was that that he had to fight the battles, and he did it the best he could. The carnage, this terrible firepower, which was available, directed on very, very limited field of fire, which made this carnage inevitable. It was a sort of ghastly situation to be in. for him to be in, and for the men to be in, for everybody to be in. It was too awful, I think. I think people realize that, but I think it's quite unfair that my father should be made a scapegoat, and his generals scapegoats, for doing their best in this almost unavoidable situation. Out of the war, his first thought was for his men, that they should be protected and be properly treated after the war, have jobs, and those in distress, the war wounded and so on, would be properly looked after and cared for.
The war ended, for the British at least, exactly where it had begun, at Mons in Belgium. Early on the morning of November the 11th, 1918, Mons was recaptured from the Germans. Captain Charles Edward Montague, former drama critic and chief leader writer for the Manchester Guardian, was there. When the war ended, I had the luck to be at the very place from which the old army was forced to retreat in 1914. It was great when 11 o'clock went and the Belgian civilians crowded into the village square to rejoice. They played Tipperary on the church bells, and we all sang the two national anthems. What luck I've had through it all. Been sniped at a dozen times and splashed with earth and little morsels of shell, and never been scratched. When the war began, Montague was already 47 years old, with a wife and 7 children. But he was determined to enlist. He dyed his hair to look younger and joined up as a private in the Royal Fusiliers. Now the war was over, he would write a bitter memoir called Disenchantment. The freedom of Europe, the war to end war, the overthrow of militarism, the cause of civilization. Most people believe so little now in anything or anyone that they would find it hard to understand the simplicity and intensity of faith with which these phrases were once taken among our troops, or the certitude felt by hundreds and thousands of men who are now dead that if they were killed, their monument would be a new Europe, not soured or soiled with the hates and greeds of the old. For this, they had willingly hung themselves up to rot on the uncut wire, or wriggled to death, slow hour by hour, in the cold filth. On the morning of November the 11th, 1918, school children all over Britain would be told to write down some memorable numerals in their exercise books. 11, 11, 11. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Never to be forgotten. At Mells in Somerset, Beatrice King cannot remember Armistice Day, but she can remember the day 2 years earlier when her brother Tom came home on leave, infested with lice.
I was going to school with other girls, you know, that I went to school with, and we had to go up a hill. And as this soldier came over the brow of the hill, and he got a little bit nearer, I said, "Oh, doesn't he look like my brother Tom?" Never thinking that it was him. And then when he got a bit nearer and I saw it was him, well, of course, I just ran to him. When I got home from school at night, my elder brother and him was outside with his trousers, killing the lice because he'd come straight out of the trenches and he was lousy. He said to my mother when he came home, he said, "Oh, Mother, I'm ashamed to come home in this state." But he said, "I've had no time at all to clean up. I was able to get through, and I came through and came on home." And I think my mother washed all his uniform and pressed it all up again so that he went back with it clean. I do remember that he was in an awfully nervous state. You know, if he was lacing up his boots or anything, he seemed to be on the watch and sort of, you know, very alert to what was going on around him, that I imagine that his nerves were in quite a bad state. Well, of course, he had to go back, and he didn't come home anymore. He told my brothers that he wouldn't come home anymore. He said, I shan't come out of it anymore.
We'd be far better off, far better off, far better off in a hug. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Here we are, here
Tom King was shot through the chest on the 15th of September 1916 in the Battle of the Somme. He died of his wounds next day.
Well, this is what came back. This is the original bag that came back. There isn't an awful lot. There's a spoon in here, and that's got a bullet hole in. And there's the disc, his identity disc. That he must have worn when he was wounded. And his scissors, his nail scissors. And his whistle, that's about all I think that came back. Nothing of any value, his watch nor anything like that, he came back. What I think was, in the First World War, they were totally unprepared. That's the way I look at it.
Tom King's brother Charlie was also killed in the war. Their names are engraved on a brass plaque in the church at Mells, together with 5 other men from the village who lost their lives. On another wall in the same church hangs an officer's sword. It belonged to the Prime Minister's son, Raymond Asquith, who was killed on the same day in the same battle as Beatrice's brother Tom. Asquith was from the opposite end of the social spectrum, an intellectual prodigy, the most brilliant classic scholar of his generation. He was married to Catherine, the beautiful daughter of the Horner family who owned the Mells estate and manor house. Raymond and Catherine had 2 daughters, Helen and Perdita, but when the war came, Raymond left for France with the Grenadier Guards.
His generation, the more intelligent ones, were rather dissatisfied with their life before the war. They were looking for some motivation. He says somewhere that life is rather barren of motives. And when the war came, they welcomed the opportunity, they didn't welcome the war, but they welcomed the opportunity to do something which they considered was really 100% worth doing. They weren't at all interested in going into business or banking or anything like that. That was considered rather unworthy. They were looking for something that was really satisfying and inwardly rewarding. I think they then took great pride in not being got down by these appalling conditions in the trenches, mud up to your waist and dead bodies floating around all around you. And they did take great pride in, as far as they could, in not letting it get them down.
Asquith wrote dozens of letters to his wife and friends, containing graphic descriptions of life and death at the front. Under bombardment, I was relieved to find that I could stand up and watch and say bugger in a perfectly even tone of voice for an hour at a time on each occasion. Some people are shamelessly abject while it is going on. You would hardly believe them human. They lie on their faces in deep yellow mud and scrabble idiotically with their hands like moles trying to scrape their way into the wall of the trench.
I used to have a little packet of letters that he wrote to us as children, and I suppose it was the same rather matter-of-fact description of horrors, which didn't strike us as particularly awful. But I think it was part of his sophistication, I suppose, in a way, that he could be so detached, but also very, very loving.
Your mother sent me the other day a very nice little story you had written about a widow in the snow. I don't get too many good stories to read out here. There are plenty of widows, but it is the rarest possible thing to see any of them making a snowman. Not for want of snow either, because we have plenty of that. I went to the top of a hill the other day to see a battle, but it was a very poor sort of battle, and I came away much disappointed. I hear you have lost some of your front teeth. Please grow some new ones again as quickly as possible, because I want you to be exquisitely beautiful, as lovely as the best kind of fairy, when I next come home to see you. But I'm afraid that won't be for some time yet.
He was offered various staff jobs, which, needless to say, his family, his wife was desperately keen that he should take something like that. But he wrote very firmly to her, if you knew, something to the effect that if you knew how the people on the staff are despised out here, you wouldn't, leading their safe lives behind the lines, you wouldn't want me to do that.
We've had a fairly filthy time of late. I've lived for a week almost entirely in muck. Another night I was in a much worse place than this. The most accursed, unholy and abominable place I have ever seen. The ugliest, filthiest, most fetid and most desolate. Craters swimming in blood and dirt, rotting and smelling bodies, and rats like shadows, fattened for the market, moving cunningly and licorishly among them. Limbs and bowels nesting in the hedges. The only dugout turned out to be a dirt trap, if not a death trap, awash with sewage and stale eyeballs and other debris. So I spent 2 days on a stretcher in a shell hole. In the gutter, certainly, but looking all the while at the stars with which you have so richly studied my memory.
My grandfather was killed in one of these terrible attacks in the Battle of the Somme in the middle of September 1916. And very few people survived. They were almost suicidal, really. And he was shot in the chest by a bullet.
When he was being taken away on a stretcher, he didn't want to discourage his men, and he asked for a cigarette and lit it. And I think died on the way to the hospital.
A few days after his son was killed, the Prime Minister wrote a letter which showed how much Raymond had meant to him. I can honestly say that he was the thing of which I was truly proud, and in him and his future I had invested all my stock of life. That is all gone, and for the moment I feel bankrupt. I drove yesterday to Mells, nearly 80 miles, to see Catherine. Her mother was there, and of course the children. I've never seen anyone so stunned and shattered. All she wants is to die.
I think before I went in, I'd seen my grandmother and said, "Why does Mother want to see me?" And she'd said, "Bad news about Daddy, darling." And I went upstairs, and she took me on her lap and told me he'd been killed. And I realised this was something much bigger than anything I could imagine it being killed was something much more serious. And I think I tried to say a few conventional words of comfort and realised that they meant nothing to her at all. And just falling silent.
On the afternoon of November the 11th, 1918, Raymond Asquith's father would stand up in the House of Commons to welcome the armistice and announce that from now on war will be recognised as an obsolete anachronism never to be revived. By this time, Asquith was no longer Prime Minister. Some say that his son's death hit him so hard that he had lost the will to be a war leader. Within a few months, he had been replaced by Lloyd George. Catherine lost a brother to the war, as well as her husband. Edward Horner, the only son and heir to the Mells estate, joined the cavalry and was shot through the groin by a German sniper. On the night before he left England for the last time, he gave a farewell dinner at the Ritz. When the upper classes went to the war, they took with them many of the privileges of life at home. On his first trip to France, Edward Horner had taken horses, a manservant, and a cook called Mrs. B. Officers shared the miseries of trench life, but there were also parcels from Fortnum and Mason, tinned partridge, turtle soup, and gentleman's relish. A lot of champagne was drunk. Some of this caused resentment in the ranks. Men who spoke out discovered what could happen if you criticized the conduct of the war. One of them was a self-confessed rebel called Albert Rochester, a railway signalman from Wiltshire. On November the 11th, 1918, Rochester was behind the lines with a signals unit of the Royal Engineers. 2 years earlier, he had run into trouble with authority. Just before Christmas, 1916, Rochester was billeted in a filthy, manure-soaked barn near Arras. He wrote an impassioned letter to the editor of the Daily Mail, complaining about the Army's inefficient use of manpower. He was especially irritated by the fact that officers had servants to look after them. I ask, as a soldier, on behalf of millions of citizen soldiers, that the officer be regarded as not of royal blood, that he be expected to clean his own boots, get his own food and shaving water. It may generate within him more respect for his rank-and-file brethren, and certainly release men for more essential military work. Yours faithfully, The Rebel, 31st of December, 1916.
Well, he worked out there were about 500,000 men doing nothing. Well, the rest were at the front. They were military policemen, batmen, servants, grooms, well behind the front, not really doing anything. And so he wrote a letter. He did submit it to the censor. He didn't try and send it direct to the Daily Mail. The censor reported it, and the next thing he knew, he was court-martialed for, what was it, conduct prejudicial to the good order and the service or something like that.
I didn't know anything about my father's court-martial until long after he died. He never talked about his experiences in the war.
He ended up on field punishment number 1, which is a bit unpleasant. 2 hours pack drill, us running around with a full pack on, pretty well exhausted. Then tied hand and foot to the wheel of a gun carriage for as long as they wanted to keep him there, just to shame him in front of his fellow troops. Then more pack drill, then all the menial tasks, the cleaning out of latrines and things like that. He had to do everything. It was really a degrading punishment for a man. On his first night of field punishment number 1, he was shoved into a barn with 5 other soldiers who'd all been on court-martial for desertion in the face of the enemy. The next morning, 2 of those were sent away to a 10 years penal servitude. The other 3 had a death sentence read out. That was a sergeant and 2 corporals. This is what my grandfather wrote about the executions. A motor ambulance arrives, conveying the doomed men. Manacled and blindfolded, they are helped out and tied up to the stakes. Over each man's heart is placed an envelope. At the sign of command, the firing parties, 12 to each, align their rifles on the envelopes. The officer in charge holds his stick aloft, and as it falls, 36 bullets usher the souls of 3 Kitchener's men to the great unknown. As a military prisoner, I helped clear the traces of the triple murder. I took the post down. I helped carry those bodies towards their last resting place. I collected all the blood-soaked straw and burnt it. Acting upon instructions, I took all the belongings from the dead men's tunics discarded before being shot. A few letters, a pipe, some fags, a photo. I could tell you of the silence of the military police after reading one letter from a little girl to Dear Daddy, of the blood-stained snow that horrified the French peasants, of the chaplain's confession that braver men he had never met than those 3 men he prayed with just before the fatal dawn. I could take you to the graves of the murdered.
The 3 men Rochester saw shot to death at dawn were all soldiers of the Durham Light Infantry. Lance Corporal John MacDonald, found guilty of quitting his post. Lance Corporal Peter Goggins, married, found guilty of quitting his post. Sergeant Joseph William Stones, married with 2 daughters, found guilty of shamefully casting away arms in the face of the enemy. For 75 years, the files on the Great War executions were kept closed. Meanwhile, many relatives were shamed into silence. On November the 11th, 1918, in Crook, County Durham, Will Stone's brother entered the news of the Armistice in the family Bible. He had never recorded his brother's death.
This page of the family Bible lists special events which are thought to be particularly significant for my family. But in all of it, there is no mention of my grandfather's only brother, Will Stones. I knew nothing of the existence of this brave little chap until 2 years ago, when I discovered, while just researching the family tree, that I actually had a great Uncle Will. This is him. And that's all there is. This little memorial thing and his last letter. And he's absolute dead ringer for my grandfather. How my grandfather could not have mentioned it to me, I still can't quite come to terms with. It's as if he never existed. The shame they must have felt. That says death was instantaneous. And it wasn't. It was the witness of the actual execution, a man called Rochester, the non-biased witness, said each of the 3 were examined by a medical officer who shook his head in each case, and the grisly task, quote, was finished by the officer with a Webley. A Webley's a 45 gun, placed against the head will blow the top of your head off. Despite 12 trained infantrymen at 12 paces shooting each of them, 12 to each, they didn't kill them. They were their friends, they didn't want to kill him. It's sick, it really is awful.
The court-martial offence with which Stones was charged was effectively cowardice, that he abandoned his rifle and ran away.
In his summing up, the defending officer makes 3 points. 1, he didn't run away. His whereabouts were known to everyone. 2, he didn't cast away his weapon in the face of the enemy. He used it, he rammed it across a trench, because he couldn't fire it, to stop a German advance. And 3, he was acting under orders. The officer that was with him, who was fatally wounded at the time, had said to him, "My God, Sergeant, I've been shot, run back and warn the battalion," which is exactly what he did. I know for a fact, at that point, you have Germans literally 4 yards away from you in a zigzag trench. I had to put my gun down and put my hands in the air straight away and said, "Excuse me, lads, that's it, the war's over for me." That would have been the simplest thing to do, instead of which he risks his life to run back and warn the battalion. And it's all here in black and white. No witnesses to the contrary. The plea is not guilty. The court find guilty, sentenced death. This one piece of paper condemns my great-uncle and the 2 corporals to have the brains blown out by the British Army. and it's signed by many levels of seniority, right up into Allenby and Haig as the top dogs in the British Army. I keep looking for some hidden agenda in here, and I think I found it with the letters between generals at the time. This is a quote from Brigadier General O'Donnell. It says, I am doubtful, however, if the evidence is sufficient for a conviction. The battalion, however, has not done well in the fighting line. They suffered somewhat severely from heavy shelling while in the Somme in July 1916. I mean, that's one of the euphemisms of all time. They were decimated. There were just a handful left. They were just blown to bits. It's all in the regimental records. They were very shaky in the advanced trenches before Guillemont in August 1916. They were set up. They went over the top and were just shot to pieces. I am reluctantly compelled, therefore, to recommend that should the finding be confirmed, the sentence be carried out for the purpose of example and to show that cowardice in the presence of the enemy will not be tolerated by the British Army. And there were 306 men shot like this.
Stones and his comrades are buried in a cemetery at Saint-Paul in northern France. The visitor's book shows that people know what happened to them and care about it, but despite many campaigns and pressure over the years, it seems unlikely that any of those executed in the Great War will ever be pardoned. Minutes before 11 o'clock on the morning of November the 11th, mechanics from Dent and Company were making sure that Big Ben was ready to strike again for the first time since the beginning of the war. Meanwhile, in Belgium, a cavalry commander of the old school was squeezing in one last attack. To Winston Churchill from Brigadier General Bernard Freyberg, VC. A line to tell you that I had the most wonderful finish to my war. We heard at 9:15 that hostilities were to cease at 11 a.m. I decided to get in touch with the Boche and raid him with my cavalry and cyclists one last time. We knew he was holding the crossing over the River Dender at the village of Le Cygne. We started at 9:50 and galloped 20 kilometers, rushed his outpost lines at the gallop at 5 minutes to 11 and charged into the village only 9 strong, shooting up the streets with revolvers and chasing Boche around blocks of buildings. We captured a bridgehead at 2 minutes to 11 and mopped up the village to the tune of 4 officers, 102 other ranks and several machine guns. I thought this might amuse you. At 11 o'clock, the Great War would end, and the world would begin to see the shape of things to come.
Tomorrow, Thoughts of a New Beginning, Part 2 of The Day the Guns Fell Silent on BBC One at 10:45.